So as was the case this morning, we have some excellent talks ahead this afternoon. We'll start off with Dr. Eric Van Hookten. Dr. Hookten is professor of nutrition and a swine nutrition extension specialist at North Carolina State University. He received his bachelor's and master's degree at Wageningen in the Netherlands, and then came to the States at NC State to earn his PhD. Dr. Van Hookten has developed a highly published, internationally known, multifaceted research, teaching, and extension program that includes applied swine research with direct applications to technology transfer. His current research foci include the evaluation of nutritional strategies for heat abatement in sows, essential fatty acid requirements of sows, impact of lipid composition and quality, and swine health and on swine health and productivity. So with that, Dr. Hookten, please proceed.
Okay.
Yep.
They don't have pockets. I'm not sure it's on right now. It's not on. It is on. Thank you, Alan, for that introduction. Thank you also to the organizing committee for the invitation to come and speak. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to interacting with you guys. So what I'll be talking about today is the impact of peroxidized lipids in nursery pigs and what kind of implications there are for their growth performance and health status. I want to recognize my collaborators, Hanor Company. I've had the pleasure to be able to work with Hanor for several years now, with David Rosero, Dean Boyd, and then Kate Zier-Rush. And I also want to recognize Petra Chang, who is a PhD student in my group, who has part of this project as her PhD thesis. So what I want to do today is to talk to you about the importance of lipids and just give you a little bit of background. Then also talk about the impact of lipid peroxidation and oxidative stress, how to measure lipid peroxidations, what kind of methods are out there to do that, how accurate are they, how important are they, and then I'll basically talk about 3 different studies that we've conducted to look at peroxidized lipids and the impacts of various aspects of pig production. And I'll come up with some conclusions and recommendations. So first of all, I think everybody in this audience knows the importance and the nutritional value of lipids, that we typically add lipids to swine diets to increase the energy content of the diet. That's especially important once we start feeding more fibrous ingredients with less energy density. So to meet that pig's energy requirement, lipids are often added to the diet to fulfill that requirement. So it's a good energy source. The second important aspect of lipids is that they provide essential fatty acids. So we have linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid that are essential in pigs. And we have some really good data in sows to show that sows have a minimum requirement of these essential fatty acids that is much higher than what is traditionally thought of. Then there are some additional benefits of lipids: reducing dust, improving palatability, improving pellet quality at low levels that we can consider. So lipids are important in pig diets, but we need to also make sure that the quality of those lipids is acceptable and that we can estimate what the energy value, preferably the net energy value of those lipids is in swine diets. So what we typically look at is MIU, moisture, impurities, and unsaponifiables. Those are basically dilutants. So the more you have of MIU, the less lipid is there to provide energy. So that's the first thing that I think you should look at. The second thing is the free fatty acid content. When you look at NOC, increasing fatty acids, free fatty acids and lipids will actually decrease the energy value. So knowing free fatty acid content is important. The degree of saturation is another item to be considered. Unsaturated fatty acids are more digestible than saturated fatty acids. So when you look in NLC, your unsaturated fatty acids have a higher energy value than the saturated fatty acids. The position in the glycerol backbone is an item that will also impact lipid digestion. We typically don't really look at that when we evaluate lipids. And the chain length of the lipids is also an important aspect. Medium chain triglycerides are absorbed directly versus lipids that are absorbed through the lymphatic system. And then the thing that I'm talking about today really is the impact of lipid peroxidation. So what impact do these components have that are produced during peroxidation on the pig performance and health? So this slide just kind of gives you a snapshot of what happens when lipids are peroxidized. And it really is much more complex than what is shown here. But just to get the idea of what is happening is once the lipids, it starts with an initiation reaction where free radicals are formed. So if you look at a fatty acid here with oxygen or another initiator of peroxidation, you'll get a lipid radical. If you add more oxygen, then you get a proxy radical here being formed. And you get another radical formed here. This initiation step is rather slow. There has to be some kind of stimulant to be able to do that. So that could be transitional metals, could be moisture, oxygen, heat, something to get this reaction started. But once this reaction starts, it goes relatively fast in a chain reaction. It's a propagation step. So you have another fatty acid here that can react with this proxy lipid to form another radical plus a lipid peroxide. So this radical then can again react with oxygen to form this compound, which can react with another fatty acids, and you basically got a circle going. So it's relatively quick once you get to this step. These lipid peroxides are very unstable and they can be cleaved in different ways depending on what the conditions are, and they can form secondary peroxidation products, aldehydes, ketones, alcohols, hydrocarbons, volatile organic acids, etc. And the production of those compounds depends on the situation that those lipids are in. So depending on the heat, depending on how much moisture, depending on how much exposure to transition metals, these compounds will vary depending on the oxidation conditions. And then the final step here is a termination step where some of these radicals will form dimers to end that chain reaction. So that's in a snapshot, lipid peroxidation and how that happens. So as you might imagine based on that, the more double bonds you have, the more likely you're forming some of these radicals, and the more likely you have lipid peroxidation taking place. So if you look at alpha-linolenic acid, which has 3 unsaturated bonds, that reaction is about 100 times faster than oleic acid. When you consider linoleic acid, it's about 10 times faster than oleic acid. So depending on the number of double bonds, that reaction can be really, really fast. So these lipid hydroperoxides and also the peroxidation products from that can be actively absorbed. They have been identified in the stomach, they have been identified in the stomach wall, they have been identified in the liver and in the GI tissue. So they can have big consequences there, because some of these components are incorporated into membrane structures. These lipids will cause these membrane structures to be more rigid. So you lose some of that fluidity of the membrane, so you can imagine the kind of implications that might have on cell signaling, ATP production, and transport of nutrients.
Is that first sentence right? Rate of lipid peroxidation.
Yes, it increases.
Decreasing degree of saturation.
No, the more saturated, unsaturation is what that should be.
Yeah, so that's not correct.
That is not correct. It increases with the degree of unsaturation. The more unsaturated, yeah. Good catch. Typo is what we talked about yesterday. But it was really not a typo. It was intended to keep you guys on, on edge. So you paying attention. So And then the other side of these metabolites is they can actually directly react with proteins, lipids, RNA, and DNA, and therefore interfere with many of the processes that take place in the body. So considering that all these processes go on in the body also, it's not just external lipids that you feed, it's also processes that take place in the body where all these reactive oxygen metabolites are formed. The body is capable of dealing with those through their antioxidant systems. And oxidative stress basically is an imbalance between the production of these radicals and the ability of antioxidant system to counteract their harmful effects. And so there are many nutrients involved in trying to provide antioxidant properties in the body, including superoxide dismutase, which has copper, zinc, and manganese involved, glutathione peroxidase, which has selenium involved, and vitamin E, vitamin C, catalase, which is iron. So there are many processes in place in the body to try and counteract the impact of reactive oxidant species in the body. So based on that, you can imagine that lipid peroxidation can have major implications on performance in pigs. And so some of the studies that I'm noting here, reduced nutrient digestibility has been reported with feeding oxidized lipids, increased oxidative stress, depletion of glutathione peroxidase, impaired cell function by interacting with proteins, lipids, membranes, enzymes, and then all in all, that will negatively affect animal performance. So this is a summary by Andrea Hansen out of Jerry Sherson's lab on some of the research that has been reported on the impact of lipid peroxidation in both swine and broilers. And so when you look at this, at the data here, this is relative to a control in percent. So when you look at average daily gain, there were 42 comparisons. That's not quite 42 studies, but there were 42 comparisons. And the mean average daily gain of pigs fed peroxidized lipids was 88.8% relative to the control, which was 100%. So there's about a 11% reduction in average daily gain. Now, studies varied all the way from a 50% reduction to actually no difference or maybe a 5% improvement when the lipids were peroxidized. For average daily feed intake, that reduction was 7.5%. So not all of the performance reduction, growth performance reduction can be explained by decreases in feed intake, but apparently a large proportion is actually a reduction in feed intake. Gain to feed is about 4% reduced. TBOS, there's a 20% increase in a measure of oxidative stress, melandialdehyde. And then vitamin E, there's a pretty dramatic reduction in the vitamin E concentration when lipids were peroxidized and fed to pigs of 54% relative to 100% control. So we have data to suggest that we are impacting pig performance, but the big question is, how are we going to measure this? Because this whole lipid peroxidation process is just a very dynamic process where products are created and products are degraded. And some of the products that created are volatile, so they go away. And so that's shown basically in this slide, where you can see that over time, for example, for peroxides, you get an increase in the level of peroxides, but over time, once that lipid peroxidation progresses, you actually go back down. So you might measure a peroxide value of 10, but you don't really know if you're on this side of the curve or if you're on this side of the curve. Same with the aldehydes. You see an increase in aldehydes, but over time, they actually decrease. Some of these acids and polymers increase, but they're also volatile, so they will actually also decrease if the temperature is high in your sample. So a lot of dynamic processes going on that makes it really, really hard to predict how peroxidized this lipid actually is. And we really need to know that to be able to predict what's going to happen to performance. Here's a list of some of the measurements that typically are taken when looking at the peroxidative status of lipids. The one that I think most people are familiar with is peroxide value. And I've already said, you don't know if you're at the beginning of peroxidation or whether you're at the end of peroxidation. So That's the first measurement that I think people will typically look at. The second one is p-anisodine value. It's an aldehyde, so it's more towards the back end of the curve that people are looking at. Malondialdehyde is another one that's done by T-bars. The Totox value is anisodine value plus 2 times the peroxide value, so it gives you that peroxide curve, plus it tells you what the anisodine value is, or the aldehyde value. And then these are more specific components, and these are primarily produced from the breakdown of linoleic acid. And so you have hexanal, 2,4-decadional, and 4-hydroxynonenal. So they are relatively specific compounds, but the assays are relatively hard to do. They're not quick, and so that makes it difficult to, try to evaluate the quality of a lipid on the fly when you get it into your feed mill. There are some predictive methods also. The active oxygen method, where you bubble oxygen through your sample, and then you measure the peroxide value over time. So if you get an increase in peroxide value, you know you're at the beginning of that curve. But if your peroxide value stays stable and it doesn't change and it's relatively low, you can probably assume that that lipid is relatively peroxidized because you're at the end of that peroxide curve. And then more recently is the oil stability index. In the oil stability index, you also bubbled oxygen or air through your sample, and then you collect the volatiles in water. You basically take the volatiles off, they go through water, and then you measure conductivity in the water. So the more volatiles go in that water, the more oxidation you have. And so the measurement there is time, because you're going to look at the time it takes when your conductivity starts to increase. And so the longer it takes, the more stable your lipid is, right? Because the quicker it is, the quicker you have volatiles, so it's actually peroxidized. So we decided that we wanted to do some studies to look at various aspects of lipid peroxidation. And the first study we did, we were really interested in looking at how does progressive levels of lipid peroxidation affect peak performance. So we wanted to look at growth performance, but we also wanted to look at some more basic things like intestinal morphology and function of the small intestine. So in this study, we used 216 weaned pigs, 55 pins, 5 dietary treatments. So we had 11 replicates per treatment group. And our treatment groups were no added lipid. And then we had diet supplemented with 6% soybean oil that was peroxidized for either 0, 6, 9, or 12 days. And then, as I said, we looked at animal performance. We did lipid and energy digestibility. We looked at absorptive capacity by orally gavaging mannitol and D-xylose, and then taking blood samples to look how fast they appear in the blood. We did gut histomorphology, and then we measured oxidative stress and antioxidant capacity. So the soybean oil, we exposed it to oxygen and heat. So we have oxygen tanks set up, and then we had barrels of the soybean oil that we basically bubbled oxygen gas through, and we heated these to 80 degrees. So you can see in the right panel, you can see the immersion heating element with the different temperatures on the top, suspended by chains into the soybean oil. And then we had a PVC pipe going into that oil that had tiny little holes drilled all the way down into it, so the oxygen would diffuse into the oil sample. These are the peroxidation parameters that we measured. So we measured the p-anisodine value, and as you can see, as we increased the days of peroxidative exposure, we increased anisodine value up to close to 40. We measured MDA, also our MDA, so that's the T-bars went up. And then peroxide value, so this initial peroxide value went from 1 to 52. And then we also did the active oxygen method, so we exposed for 4 hours and 20 hours, and you can see we get an increase in peroxide values in our samples too. So these samples were definitely oxidized, as you can tell by these numbers. And the peroxide value that people traditionally have looked at is, maybe we shouldn't go above 5 to 10 on the peroxide value. So based on that, there's not a lot of evidence for that number, because what I showed you, but that's what many people will look at, and so we were well above that. So this slide shows the growth performance. And I put on the bottom the days of peroxidation, but I also put on the bottom the peroxide value and the p-anisodine value, so you have a reference for what the numbers actually were in those oil samples. We had the control diet that had no fat added, and then we had the 6% fat added diets with the different days of peroxidation. So when you look at body weight gain in blue, you see basically that as you increase your peroxidation and you increase your peroxide value and your anisodine value, you get a linear decrease in average daily gain. This is about a 9% decrease in average daily gain when you compare the 0 versus the 12. For feed intake, also is a linear response. That's about a 7% decrease over time between the different levels. And so here too, not all of the average daily gain is explained by a reduction in feed intake, but most of it actually is. This slide on the panel on the left shows you the digestibility of fat in red and gross energy in blue. In both cases, you can see there's a linear reduction in the digestibility of fat and gross energy when peroxidation increased. And when you look at the absorptive capacity of the intestine by looking at mannitol in red and D-xylose in blue, in both those cases you see a linear reduction in the absorption or the appearance in the blood of mannitol and D-xylose after an oral gavage of these two sugar compounds. And then we looked at the histology of the intestine. And you can see there are some slight differences in histology where actually villus height seemed to be increased with peroxidation. Villus width seemed to be decreased with peroxidation, and crypt depth seemed to increase. So perhaps more proliferation of new cells in the crypt that then result in longer tips. Now, whether that's positive or negative, I'm not really 100% sure, but the data would suggest it's negative because we see reduced absorption and reduced digestibility. So MDA is a marker of oxidative stress. When we look at 0 days, and we'll see it go up. For some reason, I don't know why it would have gone down on day 12. Perhaps the composition of compounds in that oil are different that make MDA change in the blood, but I don't have a very good explanation for that. And total antioxidant capacity went down linearly as peroxidation progressed over time. So from that study, we concluded that lipid peroxidation clearly had a negative impact on pig performance. It reduced the digestibility of fat and energy, and it reduced the absorptive capacity to absorb sugars, and it modified the morphology of the intestine. And we suggest that these detrimental effects were due to oxidative stress and a reduction in the capability of the animal to have antioxidant capacity. So the response to lipid peroxidation products here was progressive. So there seems to be there has to be some kind of threshold here where lipid peroxidation causes a reduction in that performance. And in our case, that first level of lipid peroxidation was already high enough to cause a reduction in performance. So where that threshold exactly is, based on this trial, it's not quite clear. But it definitely was a linear impact there. So in the second study, we were interested again in lipid peroxidation, but we're also interested in, can we impact the performance of pigs by including an antioxidant blend in the diet as well, to potentially reduce the impact of lipid peroxidation. So in this study, we had 176 nursery pigs. We put them in 44 pins, 4 pigs per pin. That gave us 11 pins per treatment, because we had 4 treatments. And then the 4 dietary treatments were in a 2x2 factorial. We had either lipid peroxidation or not. So we had a control corn oil in this case. And then we had that same corn oil that we peroxidized for 12 days. And then we had no supplementation or supplementation with an antioxidant blend. And that antioxidant blend contained ethoxyquin, butylated hydroxytoluene, and butylated hydroxyanisole. The measurements that we did was pig performance. We were also interested in kind of having a proxy for immune response. So we used vaccination for that, and we vaccinated with porcine circovirus type 2 and Mycoplasma pneumonia, which is pretty common for nursery pigs. And then we looked at oxidative stress and antioxidant capacity, but antioxidant capacity we looked at vitamin E specifically. So in this case we used corn oil, and we used the same process that we did in the study that I presented previously. So we used oxygen and we bubbled the gas to these barrels here. The flow rate was the same. I expressed it here per kilogram of lipid in these barrels. And we did it at 80 degrees. And at the end of the peroxidation process, we actually added TBHQ as an antioxidant because we did not want that corn oil to, the control corn oil to peroxidize while it was sitting in the bin, but we also did not really want to, the other oil to peroxidize further, so we had a measurement that was sort of frozen in time. These are the numbers from the peroxidative values that we measured. So the P-N-isidine value in this oxidative process was 164. Now that's pretty high compared to the last one, right? The last one was 45, 50, something like that. Now the first one was soybean oil and this one is corn oil. So it might be related to maybe vitamin E and soybean oil being higher and being able to maybe serve as an antioxidant while we were doing the oxidative process. But this is higher than what we had. The peroxide value is also higher than what we had in the first study, because it was around 50 also there. It's 146 here. 4-hour AOM, 20-hour AOM, we increased those as we did in the last one. We did oil stability index in this case, and we found 21 hours for the control oil and only 3 hours for the peroxidized oil. So remember, less is worse. So in this case, we found these volatile compounds coming off the sample after only 3 hours. So that's a good indication that they are relatively peroxidized. And we also did the hexanal and the 2,4-decadienal, and both of those were much higher than our control diet. So definitely a peroxidized product that we fed to these pigs. Now we were able, and we were very good at peroxidizing oil, but we're not very good at always showing differences in pig performance. So in this case, we did not see any differences. We did see the lowest response in peroxidized oil with no antioxidant, but if you look at the standard error, we weren't able to detect that difference. So there's essentially no differences in average daily gain, feed intake, or gain to feed. One thing to point out on mortality, it doesn't look all that bad, but considering we had 176 pigs, that's about 10% mortality. That's not related to the peroxidized oil, that was just related to some issues at our farm with F18 E. coli. So the only differences that we could find in this study was basically on vitamin E. And I am showing you the serum vitamin E concentrations here on day 17 and day 31. Red is the control and blue is the peroxidized. And you can see that peroxidized oil decreased serum vitamin E by about 29% on day 17, and it did that by about 36% on day 31. That was a significant interaction. So vitamin E levels here are about, you know, one on average to maybe 1.3 on average there. That it could be considered relatively low. Recommendations on, you know, maybe optimizing immune response from some papers about a decade ago suggest that maybe you want to be at 3 micrograms per milliliter to optimize your immune response. So we can argue that this might be lower than what we think of as optimal. And on the right-hand side panel, I have control on the left-hand side and peroxidized on the right-hand side. With antioxidant, you actually see an improvement in vitamin E status in the control, and you see an improvement in vitamin E status in those pigs that were fed peroxidized oil. And the improvement is actually bigger in the control diets than the peroxidized diets. Now I'm not saying that all this response on vitamin E is due to the fact that this oil was peroxidized and doing this in the body, because we also know that if you have oxidized lipids in your feed, that when you analyze your feed, you actually have less vitamin E there too. So it's a combination between degrading the vitamin E in your diet, but also impacting the antioxidant status of the animal. So based on this study, we conclude that there was no effect on pig performance, MDA, antibody titers, but we decreased serum concentrations of vitamin E when we fed peroxidized lipids. The antioxidant blend, also no effect on performance, MDA or antibody titers, but we improved vitamin E concentration, and this effect was greater in control diets. And it seems that the reduction of vitamin E concentration might indicate that peroxidized oils disturb the antioxidant system, but not to the extent where performance was impacted, because we saw no differences there. And it seems also that feeding the antioxidant had a sparing effect as evidenced by increasing serum concentrations of vitamin E. So then the next and last study, we were really interested in some data that we had previously where we fed acidulated poultry fat. And we noticed in one group of pigs that was fed acidulated poultry fat, all the mortalities in that group was in the group that was fed acidulated poultry fat compared to just common poultry fat. Now, we didn't have enough power in that study to really conclude whether there was an impact on death loss there, but it kind of piqued our interest, and we really wanted to start looking at what does lipid peroxidation do under commercial conditions? Are we going to impact the health of the pigs? We can't do that with a study with 200 pigs, but we can do that with a study with 2,000 pigs, which I'll be showing you next. So this was done in collaboration with Hanor Company in one of their commercial research facilities. We had 2,200 nursery pigs, about 6 kilograms of body weight initially. We put 22 pigs per pen, and we used 100 pens. So we had 20 pens per treatment, so pretty good, powerful statistical design there, lots of observations. We had 5 dietary treatments that consisted of 5 degrees of lipid peroxidation. So we started out with actually mixing 2 diets. So we mixed the diet that had what we called 0 peroxidized lipids and a diet that had 100% peroxidized lipids. And then these 2 diets we blended on the farm using the feed logic system to generate intermediate levels. So we had a 0, 25, 50, 75, and 100% oxidized diet. So we measured pig performance, mortality, the number of pigs that were pulled, the number of pigs that were treated, and then the number of pigs that were culled that didn't make it into the finisher. We also looked at vaccination. They vaccinated against porcine circovirus type 2 and mycoplasma. And then we also looked at oxidative stress. We looked at MDA, which is a measure of lipid peroxidation. We looked at 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine, which is a measure of DNA damage. And we looked at protein carbonyls, which is a measure of protein damage. And then we also looked at antioxidant capacity. So we did a total antioxidant capacity assay, and we looked at vitamin E. So we processed a lot of fat. So we bought a lot of 35-pound containers of corn oil, and we put them in a big fat tank. And so we had about 4,000 pounds of fat in this fat tank, and we exposed it to heat. We decided not to try oxygen this time because that was going to take a lot of tanks of oxygen. So we actually bubbled air through, but we calculated the amount of oxygen in air, and we bubbled the same amount of air through to get the same oxygen level per unit of fat as we did in the previous studies. And the heating elements on this fat tank didn't quite make it to 80 degrees, so we had to go with 60 degrees. And then we blew air through that, and we had 4 pipes, PVC pipes, basically going into the compartments of this fat tank, and had holes drilled in them, and so blew a lot of air through it. You can definitely see it bubbling. And then we also decided to get more mixing, as if the bubbling was not enough mixing. We actually pumped the fat once per day. We did 15 minutes. We pumped the fat out the bottom, put it back in the top, straight back in the top, just to make sure that we had good mixing going on. So that's how we did that. And then, just to make sure we had peroxidation, before we fed this to 2,000 pigs, we actually measured T-bars over time, and we measured the peroxide value over time. And when we got to 150, 160, we said, okay, we are at the level that we did in our previous study, so that's good enough to ship and start feeding. So these are the data for the peroxidative status of the corn oil. P-anisodine value was 30 in this case, so that was less than the previous study, and it was less than the first study also. So it's not as high as we've had it before. Perhaps it's a temperature issue, I don't really know for sure. Initial peroxide value was 185. We already knew that because we measured that. And that's about the same as the second study, and it's higher than the first study. Oil stability index, it took 48 hours to detect oxidative products in the control diet. So pretty good quality. Of course, we had added antioxidant in this one too, right? So it took a long time, but you can tell we definitely did some real damage to that corn oil in terms of getting it peroxidized nicely, because it took less than an hour for those volatile compounds to show. We measured hexanal, 2,4-decadienal, and we see also those go up. They're a little bit less than in the second study. And then we had TBHQ in these diets, and you can see that we can still measure it in the control diet, but in the peroxidized diet, that antioxidant was almost completely consumed. So it's definitely doing something in those fats. But so I think we had a good oxidized fat here to look at, lipid here to look at, or oil. So when you look at growth performance, you basically see no differences. And this is basically growth performance of the pigs that remained in the pen. So it's a little bit dangerous to look at that, right? These are your healthy pigs that stay in the pen and that are going to your finisher. So we didn't see any responses there. But then when you look at the viability of the pigs, you see pretty big differences. So in the red bars, that's the full value pigs. Those are the pigs that at the end of the nursery are moved into the finisher. So the full value pigs were basically going from about 98.5% going down to about 96, 95.5, 96%. So we're decreasing the number of full value pigs as we increase the levels of peroxidative products in the diet. We're increasing death losses, and we're increasing the number of culled pigs. And the culled pig is basically a pig that is not, that we consider a runt. It's less than 30 pounds. It's not worth it to put it in the finisher. So those were culled. So if you take into consider all of this, then you're basically decreasing your number of pigs that you send to the finisher by about 4%. And that's significant money. When you look at medical treatment, so we had two ways to do medical treatments, right? So we had pigs that were identified according to criteria of failure to thrive, respiratory distress, leg problems. If we identified pigs that needed to be treated, they would be treated. If we identified pigs that were in really bad shape that needed to be pulled into a cull pen, then we would do that, and those pigs would also be treated. But we would continue those pigs on their treatment plan. So those pigs went to a cull pen, but they were continued on the same treatment that they were on, so we could still track them. So if they would recover, we would count them as full value pigs. When you look at the data here, and in both cases, you see medication of those pigs and the number of pigs pulled increased as peroxidation progressed. So there's a treatment cost associated with that, right? A medication cost. So when you take that all into account and you say, okay, I started with a pen of pigs, 22 pens, I know how much weight I started with, now how much weight did I end with? The dead pigs are not really going to count, right? And the ones that are not going to make it to the finisher are not going to count either. So when you do that, you see a linear reduction in the amount of gain per pen that ultimately is, going to pay the bills. So as peroxidation progressed, we see a linear reduction in the total pig weight gain per pen. So just looking at some serum chemistry really quickly, we did not see any impact on any antibody titers or markers of oxidative stress, except for we saw a change in vitamin E and we saw a change in total antioxidant capacity. And what we'll see is basically a reduction in vitamin E and a reduction in total antioxidant capacity. It's not completely nice and linear, because we got 2 points here at 100% where we see an increase. That really doesn't make a lot of sense to me because of the way we designed the study. We had an oxidized oil and a control oil, and we kind of blended them together. So we're not really changing products of peroxidation per se, we're changing proportions. But we're not changing one product, an istidine going up versus hexanol going down. We're not changing composition of peroxidation products, we're changing level. So you would really expect this to be linear, which it was not. And I don't have an explanation for that. Then if you look at the economic analysis, really quickly calculated on 1,000 pigs that had a similar start weight. And then you look at full value pigs in the nursery, so you're going from 98.8% to 95.9%. So you can calculate the total number of pigs that go to the finisher. The average weight at the end was not different. And then you put a value on them. And then you subtract the number of cull pigs that don't make it to the finisher. And then you can calculate what kind of value or what kind of losses you get. So the bottom number here, the loss per pig placed, is basically in the order of $1.14 to $1.33 per pig due to peroxidized lipids. So that gives you a little bit of perspective of what the economic incentive is of trying to quality control your fats and oils fed to finishing pigs. So in conclusion, it's pretty clear that peroxidation had negative impact on pig performance and productivity. It's a population response, so it's done in a commercial facility where we expect perhaps more stress due to crowding, disease, etc. And we see an increase in the number of pulled pigs, excessively light pigs, mortality, and medical treatment with peroxidation. We don't know if this is only in nursery pigs or if this is the same in finishing pigs. We would expect nursery pigs perhaps to be more sensitive, and there are probably differences in genetics too, but we did not measure that. So overall conclusions then and challenges. It's pretty obvious that lipid peroxidation is a complex process that is difficult to understand and is even more difficult to measure. We really need to find a way to get a good, quick, complete characterization of lipid peroxidation so we can match performance with what we should measure in these lipids. It's also pretty clear from past research that there's oxidative stress, compromised immunity, decreased intestinal function, and a reduced growth performance associated with lipid peroxidation. And we have shown data here that this is a progressive process. As you increase your peroxidation, you get more detrimental responses. So what we really need to look for is what is that threshold and what is that lipid peroxidation number that we need to shoot for. So on the field condition, we've shown a pretty important impact on the output of the farm. And of course, the financial value of retaining viable pigs is an important driver of economic return. So it really remains a challenge to actually really come up with a good measure of lipid peroxidation, and that probably needs to include a variety of measurements. And as I said, we don't know if wean pigs is the same as sows, as finishing pigs, and whether genetic makes it different, and that's something that would be interesting to look at in the future. So with that, thank you for your attention, and if there is time for questions, I'll be happy to address them or during the break.
Thank you, Eric.